everybody? I can't see anybody. Are there lots of people, or is it just me talking to myself? Well, good morning. I'm glad to talk to you guys. That's wonderful. We shall get started. Thankfully, there's a lot of time, and Spring Boot is very quick, so we can do a lot in the time we still have left. I'm happy to be here. Can I see the audience? Can you move the camera to them? Me? I'm in San Francisco right now. Can you turn the camera around so I can see the audience? Good morning. Hi, everybody. Cool. Thank you. I just took a photo of you guys. Okay. So I'm going to move this down here. My name is Josh Long. I'm very honored to be with you guys this morning. My company has a stupid travel policy, and so I am very sad that I could not be there this time. I love Ukraine. I love the food. I love borscht. I love everything about it, and I'm sorry I haven't been back. But I will hopefully be there sooner rather than later. But thank you for joining me today. We're going to talk about Spring Boot. Spring Boot is a way of building applications today that is simpler than a lot of things that you might have seen before, and it's a way of focusing attention. Okay, so it's a way of building applications with Spring and focusing attention. It supports many different new patterns. Is my screen large enough for you guys today? Is it okay? I can't see. Hang out. Yes, no. Is it big enough to see type and so on? If I go to Sublime and say, hello world, is that too small? Like that, maybe? Bigger? Okay, good. So we'll keep it around that font. I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out in a minute. Don't want to save changes. I have a couple slides. I might as well do them now. We are part of a new company, so I don't know how many of you have heard, but Spring is now part of a new company called Pivotal. Pivotal started in 2013 in April, and it's open source technology all over. So it's the Spring team, Cloud Foundry, RabbitMQ, Tomcat, Groovy, Grails, Redis. We have a Hadoop distribution. Lots of great open source technology under one new company called Pivotal. And one thing that we did when we created this new company was we did everything we can to make getting started with Spring as simple as possible. So for example, we have this great new website called spring.io. Spring.io is our homepage. It's the new page for Spring on the web. And of course, there are the usual things like the blog, and the amazing sleepless Rob Winch, who never sleeps. There's also the guides here. These guides are particularly important if you're a new Java developer and you want to learn how to build interesting things. These guides are all 10 to 15 minutes long, and each guide is about it's about a specific type of task. If I want to build a REST service, I might use this guide. If I want to talk to Android, I can use this guide. Or if I want to upload multi-part files, there's an upload guide. There's guides for working with Batch and for working with JMS and for talking to Twitter and to Redis and to lots of things. And these are all 10 to 15 minutes long. There are guides for Hadoop as well and WebSockets. I mean, just everything you can imagine, there's a guide. And these guides they're meant to make it so that you can learn how to do one thing very quickly, right? So each guide, there's no magic. We say, okay, here's what you're going to get. You're going to get a REST service, for example, that looks like this, and it's going to have this JSON payload, and you should be able to send in this parameter called name and so on. And you need these tools and that time, And there's a Git repository for everyone. So if you want to go to GitHub and follow the code, you can, or just throw the code away and follow the guide completely. So it shows you everything you're going to need. It shows you how to create the directory structure, for example, and how to create the build file. Here's a Gradle build, but there's also a Maven one in the Git repository. And it shows you every class. So there's no magic, there's no assumptions. We do not assume anything. And then all the code, or most of the code, is using Spring Boot. So it's also very simple to get started. It should be very, very simple to get a working application up and running in 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, okay? So I hope you will check those out. They're a very good way to get started. We're going to talk about Spring Boot generally today. Spring, as you know, is very rich. How many of you are using Spring? Just curious. Let me check out that Hangout here. Wait, I need to get to the Hangout so I can see Google Plus Hangouts. Spring? Yeah, okay, good. So you guys are Spring users. How many of you are using Spring 3? Spring 3. Hi again, take more photos. What about Spring 2.5? I'm scared. Oh, you're not going to like this talk, my friend. The one guy who raised his hand for 2.5, he's going to look at this and he's going to be mad because he has to go back and use 2.5, you know, when this is so much nicer. But the rest of you, Spring, how many of you are using Spring 4? Just curious. Oh, right on, good. So Spring 4 just came out a few months ago, last November or December, and it's very, very powerful. And there are a lot of great features, but my favorite feature is the @conditional annotation, which powers Spring Boot. So when you use Spring Boot, you're getting sort of the best foot forward. You're getting our recommended approach to solving different problems using Spring, okay? So to make that clear, you know, we have this pretty picture here, this architecture diagram, which depicts the Spring I/O platform. And when you look at the diagram, we say, okay, well, we want developers to start building applications. If they're going to build a general purpose sort of Spring application, they should look at Spring Boot. If they're trying to build a web application and they want to use the Groovy programming language, then Gradle, of course, is a perfect fit. Spring XD is our big data solution. Okay, so it's very good for stream processing. It's very good for Hadoop integration. It's very good for long-running batch and integration solutions. You can do all that with Boot, but Boot is more of a code-centric, whereas XD is more of a job console. It's an operator-friendly console for managing jobs, large big data types workloads. And then, of course, all of these technologies build on top of the foundation, right? All these different libraries that you know about in Spring for big data, for batch, for database access, for security, for reactive web applications, and so on. So Spring Boot simplifies all this. We hope that you will start with Spring Boot and you can take advantage of all these libraries. Now, getting started with Spring Boot is very easy. If you're using the Spring Tool Suite, right, our Eclipse distribution, you simply load the editor, and then when you get to the, I'm going to say JEEConf, hello. Wait for it to boot the world here. Just out of curiosity, I'm just wondering, how many of you use Eclipse? Okay. Anybody use IntelliJ? Okay, so there you go. So I will use IntelliJ because it seems like the majority here. But you can use either one. If you're using Eclipse, you can go to if you use STS, our Eclipse distribution, you can go File, New, Spring Starter Project, and you get this very fancy little dialog. Okay, this dialog says, okay, I want to build a web application for I want to build a web application that uses JPA. So I choose web and I choose JPA here. If I don't, I can choose whatever. I can just fill out the form group and the artifact and the description and the package. And then I hit next, and what I get is a URL. This URL, I can copy and paste it, or I can just hit finish. And what I get is an empty project inside of my Eclipse environment that is using Spring Boot, right? The code that I am given is fairly boring. There's nothing particularly magical about it. So you can see I have a public static void main, and it's got a few annotations. I have a empty property file here, and then of course I have an empty unit test class, right? So again, no magic, not a lot of magic stuff here. You can see there's also a build file, a Gradle build, as well as a Maven build. So by default, we're going to use the Maven one, but you can use whatever choice you want, right? You can use SPT if you want, for example. Our build file is, one thing that Spring Boot tries to do is to simplify even the build file. So for example, when we chose those checkboxes in the dialog, we said we wanted web support We wanted JPA support. Those checkboxes are dependencies that we get out of the box here, right? So I can go Spring Tool Suite, font, basic, text editor, edit. I'm going to say 14 to make this a little bit bigger. Apply, okay. So those dependencies are one-to-one. They match the checkboxes in that dialog. So these are opinionated dependencies that we provide for Spring Boot. The Spring Boot starter for web brings in Spring MVC. It brings in REST support. It brings on validation support. It brings in JSON marshalling support. It brings in everything, and it brings in file upload support and the Servlet 3 API and everything you need for web programming. You're done. You just choose this dependency, and it brings in everything. Same thing for JPA. If you need JPA, this brings in the JPA stack. It brings in Hibernate. It brings in Spring's transaction management support. It brings in Spring's JPA support, etc. So this is not just optional. You've got everything you need. And since our parent is pointing to a Spring Boot starter parent, we get all the versions managed in the parent. So I don't have to specify what version of Spring and what version of Spring's transaction management, and I don't even have to specify Hibernate or the logging API or any of this stuff. It's just all taken care of for me. So if you look at the Maven dependencies here, you can see I've got a very rich stack, a stack that's already managed for me. All these different versions and everything, it's already provided. Jackson and the Tomcat and support for YAML if I want to do YAML configuration instead. All of this comes here out of the box. So just very, very simple builds, right? If you look at the Gradle build, it's the same thing, right? Same basic ease of use. So here, of course, in Gradle, it's much simpler. So I have 3 lines here, right? 3 lines for dependencies. One is for the web support, one is for JPA, but that's it. I don't have to do anything else. So you can do that from Eclipse. That works fine. I'm going to go ahead and hit escape, or just go to start.spring.io. This is the web service version of the same thing. So you go to group, you can specify the artifact, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to go ahead and say actuator. I'm going to say that I want REST repositories, that I want web, I want JPA support, and then that's okay for now. But of course, I could have chosen MongoDB or Redis or whatever, right? I will hit generate, and this will give me a zip file. I go to the desktop here. I'm going to copy and paste the zip file here. I'm going to say JEEConf, okay, .zip. Get rid of that for now. Don't need this. Oops, I've already unzipped it, so I don't need either of those. And then again, same thing as before. Oops, I do need that actually. Sorry, I downloaded the wrong one. Command photos. Paste this here. Unzip, and this is the code. This is the same thing as we had in Eclipse, right? So nothing fancy, no magic, just the same thing, right? So you can write this code yourself if you want, but it's just 5-10 lines. You're not. There's no magic. You don't have to use this code generation if you do not wish. So open up your favorite editor. I'm going to go ahead and open up IntelliJ here. You can use Eclipse, NetBeans, Vim, Emacs, whatever. Right? There's no specification. Open up the Maven build. And then I want to build an application, right? So the best way to show this is to just build something. So I'm going to go ahead and delay this for now. I'm going to say no. I'm going to use Java 1.8, right? So this is the actuator, which is a checkbox, JPA, REST support, web support. And I'm going to go ahead and choose Java 1.8. Oops, 1.8, please. I'm going to say @enable auto import. It's going to say, do I want to reload? I say yes, please. And then the result is preferences, bigger, manage, close, let's see, code style, general, we want Java to be bigger. I know, I love that thing, so bigger, but so that everything is bigger, I will use this. There you go, and then yes, presentation mode is the best thing ever. So I can do that if I want, but you end up having to switch back and forth. So okay, there's our Maven thing. I'm going to go back to the, I'm going to go Command-Shift-A, application.java, hide this. And what I have here is an empty public static void main, and I have a configuration annotation. I have Spring's component scan annotation. These are standard. This has been around forever. You can use this both since Spring 3.0 in 2009. And then this is a Spring Boot annotation. It says to Spring Boot, I need your help. Do everything you can to make this as easy as possible for me because I have a life and I want to go home and hug my children and see my wife. I mean, anything, you know, just do it for me. So this is the Spring Boot, I need help checkbox, okay? Then you have in public static void main, you have Spring application, which comes from Spring Boot, .run, and then this simply returns an application context, right? So like so, right? And I just get that, but of course you don't need the application context mostly, so no worries. What I like to do when I build, when I show people this is I like to build something with a very simple domain so that we do not waste time trying to understand the domain, right? So in there's a application called Open Table. It's got a mobile application. It does one thing very well. It lets you create a booking for a restaurant or like a restaurant basically. So we'll do something like that. We want to create a reservation, okay, or a booking. This is the same as a reservation. We're going to use JPA. Remember we had the JPA annotations on the class path. So I'll go ahead and create an entity there. It's going to have, of course, a booking name like this, and it'll have an ID, right? So long ID. I'm going to have @ID @generated value. Again, I'm using JPA here. You can use MongoDB. You can use any other Spring Data project if you want, you know. But this is just good for SQL access. Are a lot of you? Let me ask you a question and get back to here. Are a lot of you using SQL of some sort? Okay, still something that people are using. Of course, you can use MongoDB or Redis or Gemfire or Neo4j or Cassandra or whatever, or Couchbase or Elasticsearch, right? Lots of different technologies. Go back here, application.java. So okay, I've got an entity. You can remember we're gonna be using Java. Java is a language. If you're using another language, you can do something like case class. Like in Scala, for example, I could just do case class booking, val ID, long, whatever, val ID, booking name, string, etc. Right? And of course, you have the annotations in the right place. But the language I'm using is Java. It happens to be very noisy. So in order to do what I'm going to be doing, I need to generate a constructor, right? I'm going to also generate another constructor for JPA that has no arguments. I need to have getters, right? So I'm going to do that. I need a nice convenient toString, so I created this. So yes, this is just a basic JPA entity, but there's a lot of code here for JPA, right? I can't really make it simpler unless I use another language. Then, of course, the question is, well, I need to talk to a database. So the first thing I will do is I will go to my dependency here, and I'm going to add an in-memory embedded database. I'm going to add H2, right? If I go back to my code here, if I go back to my application class, for example, and in my Java configuration class, if I add a data source like this, just standard Spring data source definition, then this will be used. But if I do not use it, if I do not define one, Spring Boot will automatically create one for me by convention. Okay, so this will do, it'll look on the class path, it'll see that I have an in-memory embedded database like H2 or Derby or HSQL, and it'll automatically create a data source for me. So I don't need to do that now. This is good for development, for getting started very quickly. I want to handle standard CRUD, create, read, update style operations. So I'm going to create a booking repository. This is a JPA, a Spring Data JPA feature, right? So I'm going to just use it. And what it basically does is it says, okay, I'm going to create an interface. It's going to extend JPA repository. JPA repository comes from Spring Data. There are similar interfaces for MongoDB and for Gemfire and for all these other ones as well. And it has methods for finding all and for saving and deleting and for finding one, etc. Of course, if I go here, I can see that it extends the paging and sorting repository, which has methods for sorting and for finding records based on their type, right? So I can say, if you give me a sort condition, sort by the booking name column, or sort by ID, or sort by whatever, you can specify it here. And if I want to say find a page 1 of 10, or find page of 2 of 10, then I can specify that there. So a very convenient way of working with data. And even better, if I specify finder methods like this, right, this gets automatically provided for me at runtime, right? So Spring Data will look at my method here, and it will translate this method based on the name of the method. So find by booking name, right? So booking name, it gets translated into select all from booking equals like that, right? That's what's happening behind the scenes. That's what happens at runtime. So it's just convention. Of course, I can override all that. I can say add query like this, select from booking, whatever, right? You can specify your own query if you want, but you can use JPA if you want as well. So okay, so now we've got a simple way of reading and working with the data. Spring Boot is very much based on convention. So if I go to my source main resources folder and I put a file called data.sql, it will read that file for me, right? So insert into booking, booking underscore name values, JEEConf. Okay, Josh, I don't know, Phil, this is one of the co-creators of the Spring Boot project. This is Dave. So we all have reservations at this one restaurant. Who knows what restaurant, who cares? But now, if I start the application up, I can actually read the data. I want to read the data from the database, right? I want to actually look at the data from the database. So I will create a bean. Let me hide the side here, command 1. I'm going to create a bean of type command line runner. And this is just a callback interface that has one argument, and it takes one method. It has one argument in the method, and the argument is string arguments, right? So it's the same ones that you have here. It's a callback. It gives you the arguments to public static void main, and then you can do whatever you want with it, right? So here I'm going to say, give me the booking repository, and then with the booking repository, I can say booking repository dot find all dot for each system dot out print line, So all I'm going to do is print out every record in the database. Of course, you may not do this a lot, but it's good for a demo, right? So here we go. Run the application. And this is Java 8 syntax. I'm using a lambda. I'm saying, okay, well, since I have an interface that has one method, I want to substitute a lambda for this interface. And then when you see the application start up, first of all, notice how good that ASCII artwork is. I think this is very important. It would make me happy to believe that we worked on this first, but obviously we did not. But still, don't you think that's pretty cool? And then other than that, you can see the normal stuff. You can see JPA creating our tables. You can see the query that we ran here, right? So we're saying find all, and then for each record that we get back, we print it out. So this is the query results, right? Select all from whatever. And then we're saying for each result that comes back, print out the data. So here's each JPA entity with its ID and the value in the database being printed out for us. So okay, not bad, right? We've made a lot of progress here very quickly. I can also, of course, make this a little bit more robust. I can say, okay, well, let's do this again, but this time like this, right? So quote like that. Whoops. Copy this. Here we go. Paste, and then I'm going to stop this, and I'm going to toggle presentation mode. Sorry, toggle. Okay, and what you see up here is there's a very convenient feature that I always forget. Always choose this single instance only. It's super useful for this kind of thing. So hit OK, and then next time you run it, it'll kill the existing one before you start again. So presentation mode, good. Gonna run it again, run application main, and then you'll see the great ASCII artwork, of course. And then you'll see the 4 records and then the single 1 record. Okay, so already we've made a lot of progress. I haven't had to configure much of anything, right? I want to do more. So obviously I like to say that, they say that any application of sufficient complexity eventually sends email. I like to think that applications of sufficient complexity these days eventually have a REST API. So we'll use Spring's really good REST support. We're going to say REST controller, booking, REST controller. Okay, and I'm going to create a method here that returns booking objects. And I'm going to do something here. I'm going to do the good, clean, object-oriented thing. Okay, so I'm going to say booking repository like this. And then, of course, I'm going to need to provide a constructor, and it's going to have the dependency auto-wired in. But of course, if you're lazy and you're like me, you can just do this. You can just get rid of all that, and much simpler. So I will probably do this in my demo because I'm lazy and we're trying to keep everything on one page. But what you should do is do that. You should do the clean, object-oriented constructor injection and so on, right? Don't do what I'm doing, not even at home when nobody is looking, by yourself. Okay, just don't do it. It's nasty. This is really bad for unit testing, but it is simpler to read, so that's why I'm doing this. Okay, so this .booking repository .find all, right? We're simply returning the data from the repository. Okay, and move that around. Good. And then I need to actually declare a request mapping. So I'm saying do this bookings. Okay, and I'm going to stop this and restart it. And so Spring Boot is going to see that we have a REST controller, and it's going to see that we have a web component, and it will start up a web server for us, right? So if I go over here, localhost 8080 bookings, you can see I've got the JSON data coming back from the database very, very quickly, right? I didn't have to work to set up this. I didn't have to configure Spring MVC or anything. And in fact, I've got a web server already. I didn't deploy to a Tomcat. I didn't deploy to anything. Based on our application, Spring Boot started up a container for us, right? And this is actually, there's actually a lot of other stuff here. I have to be honest with you. I worked maybe a little too hard here. I worked a little too hard. I don't even need to write that. I could just get rid of this, and then maybe go back here and say @import REST repository. There you go. So this is going to import the Java configuration class for Spring Data REST. Okay, and then I can use Spring Data REST, and I can annotate my repository with a repository REST resource. Stop the existing one, and then start it again. And then this will automatically generate a REST API for me based on this repository. Okay. So now I can go back here and refresh my page, and now I get hypermedia, right? This is HATEOS, HATEOS, like this, right, like that. So this is a design pattern. It stands for hypertext as the engine of application state, right? So there you go. So this is just it's a design pattern for REST services that provide links that describe the REST payload. Okay, so here I have the REST service automatically provided for us, and now I can do things like go to /1, and I can create and read and update them as well using standard REST HTTP put and delete and post and so on. Even better, it's got paging and sorting support, right? So I can say page equals 1 and size equals 1 or 2. Okay, so here I'm saying, give me offset 1. Go to page 1, not page 0. Remember, the first 2 records were JEEConf and Josh. So I went to page 1, and then I said, give me just 2 records, not all 4. Right? So I get all of that out of the box. I just use that annotation here, right? Okay, so that's fine. we can also build an, this is a web application after all, and so you might want to access all this data from a standard Spring MVC HTML page. By default, if you're creating a template, Spring Boot will look for that template in the templates directory. So source main resources, templates. I'm going to create a new file called bookings.html. And I'm going to go ahead and cheat a little bit to be quick. Okay, so GitHub, REST MVC, more, okay, raw, faster GitHub, come on. Go back to my code, paste this in here for now. I will remove this JavaScript. So what you have is a basic HTML page, command 1. It's a basic HTML page, standard HTML5 friendly, right? Get rid of that for now. And all it does is it's going to render. It's going to render all the booking data coming back from the bookings model. Okay, so standard Spring MVC. It's going to do a for loop, right? So for each booking, render this block of HTML, and then inside the HTML, it's going to render the ID and the booking name. If I go back to my Java code, I can create here a regular controller, a regular Spring MVC controller. Okay. Okay, and I'm going to say string bookings at request mapping bookings.html. It could be anything, by the way. This is my custom string, so you can name it that. You know, you can name it whatever you want. It has no bearing on anything. This is your string. There's no default or whatever, you know. So, and then of course I'm going to need the booking repository. So I say booking repository like so. Right. Dot find all. And so all that's going to do, oops, I'm going to say I need to actually create a model, right? So this is an MVC thing. It's not a REST endpoint. So I'm going to create a model. I'm going to say model.add attribute bookings. There we go, like that. And then I'm going to say return bookings. And so this is going to be used to resolve the template to render. So if you're using JSP or FreeMarker or Velocity or TimeLeaf or GSP from Groovy, and Gradles, of course, anything, right? So by default, this will look inside of source main resources templates, right? It's gonna apply this pattern. The view resolver will find it, view name plus .html. So this is going to find source main resources templates bookings.html, and as you've seen, we've got a bookings.html that looks like this. So if you run the whole application again, start up the application, go ahead and kill this just in case, and I'll restart it. Okay. You get back the same thing as before. Then you go back here. REST is still working. The rest is all good, right? But now I can go back to localhost bookings dot, what did we say, PHP? I think we said PHP. We said PHP, yes. So just to show you that there was no magic here, just any name you want. What did I do wrong? Oh, right, we have to have TimeLeaf on the class path. That's important. Yeah. So I'm going to go back to my Maven build here. I'm going to copy a dependency, right? I'm going to say Spring Boot starter TimeLeaf. I'm going to stop this and then restart it. And it's going to pick up the new jar on the class path. Okay. Go back to my UI here. And there you go. So I have the HTML template is rendering just fine. It's generating the data from the server side. So you can see it's being rendered in the HTML there. We have the REST endpoint just as before. And this is all very quick. And of course, if you can use whatever you want, but we're using TimeLeaf because it's natively supported and it's just a very natural fit. Okay, so we've got a pretty interesting, kind of a boring, let's be honest, it's a very boring web application. It's a web application babysitting a database, right? This is a very, very common use case. I want to build a web application babysitting a database, and of course I have REST support as well. I have this repository which I can use to handle creating and reading and updating and all that stuff. It handles a lot of the complex logic for me, okay? So now I suppose I could be finished. I could say that this is a working application. But if you've ever read Michael Nygaard's amazing book called Release It, he says that production ready is not the same as feature complete, right? Building an application that works well in production is not the same as finishing all your tickets in Jira or GitHub issues or whatever. There's a lot of work that you have to do to make an application that you can use in production successfully. And Spring Boot is optimized for production. We have added this dependency. We have added org Spring Framework Boot, Spring Boot Starter Actuator. And then this installs a lot of support that you can use in a production application to handle things like management and monitoring and your health and so on. So here's our application, just as before. Nothing has changed, right? Now if I go to this endpoint, and you can see it's called bookings.php, I can go to metrics here. This is an endpoint that's automatically installed for us just because we have that actuator jar on the class path. So bookings, here's a bookings endpoint. Here's another one called bookings.php. This says that we have made 8 requests to /bookings, and it has a status code of type 200, right? So here's the bookings endpoint again. Make another one, make another one, make another one, make another one, a lot of them. And then refresh, and you can see the status. I mean, you can see the count has been updated to reflect the new requests, right? You can also see how much memory we have, how much memory is free, the processors, and so on. You can also see things like beans, right? All the beans that were defined for you by Spring MVC and by Spring Boot. So this is the booking MVC controller. Here's the reference controller and the schema and the entities and all that stuff that gets created for you by Spring Boot automatically behind the scenes. It's all here, right? And you might be thinking, well, that's very cool, but I don't want all this in production. That's a danger. That's probably something that people should not see. And there's a lot of easy ways you can easily disable and configure Spring Boot. One of the easy ways to configure it is to look at the configuration properties that are supported, right? So right now, we want to know about the configuration properties related to the beans endpoint, right? That's the one we were just looking at that we should probably not have in production, right? So we know that by looking at this config props endpoint, config props, we know that looking at that endpoint that we can configure the beans endpoint by using properties that start with endpoints.beans.enabled, for example. So what I will do is I'm going to go back to my application here. I'm going to go to application.properties, and I'm going to say endpoints, let's see, endpoints.beans.enabled equals false, right? And of course you don't need that if you don't want it, you can just do this. And that's the same property that we saw here, right? So endpoints.beans.enabled equals false. And when I reload the application, that will disable the beans endpoint. So we'll do that in a second. But this is another great endpoint to know about. It tells you all the properties that you can use to configure everything. You notice that we have an embedded Tomcat that starts up the web server for us and listens on port 8080. If I change this, if I want to say that my application starts up on port 9090, I can say server.port equals 9090. So going back to my configuration here, I go to server.port 9090, and then of course when I restart the application, everything will be on 9090 now. I'm going to go ahead and change one more thing before we restart. I'm going to go ahead and add one more library here. I'm going to say I want Spring Boot Starter Remote -shell. I'm going to add org Spring Framework. And this is going to simply install a shell that we can use as well. So I'm going to go ahead and restart. Everything will be picked up now. First things first. This is here, of course, right? Well, oops. Of course, it's not 9090, right? So it's not 8080 anymore. It's got to be 9090. So that's the first thing, right? We also want to we don't want to be able to get to the beans endpoint anymore, so that no longer works. Remember, we disabled it. The other stuff works. The metrics, for example, still works, right? I can disable it if I want. There's a health endpoint that's very nice. This health endpoint comes out of the box. But, you know, as with everything in Spring, you can easily override this. So this gives you the current status of the application. It gives you the current database stack if you have one in play, and it gives you the result of the validation query that you get when you use our default health endpoint. So this is going to look at the database connection pool that was created for you automatically. It's going to use a validation query like select one, and then it'll give you the result of the validation query. If you're not using JPA, then this or a SQL database, then this won't matter. You won't see this. You won't see this either. And if you're using something different, like for example your own, you know, some other database, or you have your own version of health, you know, you have your own idea about what constitutes a health endpoint, then you can simply override it, right? So here I'm going to return a bean of type map string object, right? And I'm going to say I'm going to return my own health, you know, whatever. The method name determines the bean name, but in this case the bean name is not important, right? The interface for health indicator is simply return T of health, okay? By default, what you get is the vanilla health indicator. We're going to go ahead and provide our own. We're going to just say health indicator return, right? So it's just a lambda. And I'm going to return collections.singleton map status right, so that's my new status. And actually, I don't even need that. I don't need this. I don't need that. And I don't need that. So you can actually do all this stuff. You can do whatever you want, of course. But in this case, I'm going to return a simple health indicator that has a payload of type map. And then, of course, when I reload it, I can now see the health indicator updated to reflect this, right? So this is an example of where Spring Boot provides something out of the box, but simply by defining a bean, or earlier we used little properties, we can override everything, right? So here's our new health endpoint, right? We get this just by defining a bean of type health indicator. You saw earlier that we added a shell, right? So if you look at the output of our console here, up here, there we go. By default, it's going to create a password and a username. If we use Spring Security, we can override this. We can provide our own username and password scheme. But in this case, it's going to provide us a default shell. And we can use that shell, for example, to access a lot of the same information that we just used just from those REST endpoints, right? So I'm going to say command ++ SSH -p 2000 user at 127.0.0.1. I'm going to paste in the password that was on the console there, and now I'm logged in, and I can say, okay, well, where do I go now? Well, I can say, give me some help. And then from here, I can say system prop ls, you know, what properties do we have? I can say, what does the environment look like? I can say metrics, metrics, you know, give me the metrics that we had before. But this is a live metrics indicator, right? So if I go here and I refresh health, you know, you can see it being refreshed here automatically. If I go to config props, you know, whoops, it's 9090. Of course, I will see that now here as well. So this is live, whereas the other one is REST. I can do things, I can say java type java.lang.string. And of course, I'll get a reverse engineered version of the type. My favorite feature is dashboard, because look, you get Java top, you know. You also get information about the memory, right? So this is like your PS, or this is like your Java top, like I said. This is your PS, that's your Java top down here. You'll notice that we have metaspace. So this is a Java 8 feature, but you can use, if you're using Java 6 or 7, then you'll get permgen, right? So metaspace is what you get inside of Java 8, but if you're using Java 6 or 7, it works just fine as well, right? So a lot of this stuff, you just get it for free out of the box, right? So here we go. What else do I want to show you? I don't know. There's a lot of stuff there. Help shows you everything, right? So I can also do I can see what's being automatically configured just by saying autoconfig, right? I can say endpoints, health endpoint, right? And that gives me, endpoint invoke, health endpoint, and that gives me the same information that we saw from the REST API from inside this secure SSH shell, right? Of course, and again, because we want to support production by default. So JMX is also already natively supported, right? I think it's here. I go connect. This is an insecure, non-SSL secure connection. Go ahead. And then I can go to the mbeans, and I can go here and I can say org Spring Framework endpoint. Here's my health endpoint. I'm going to say operations, get the data. And of course, the status that I had in that health indicator is now being returned from this JMX console, right? You can do a lot of stuff from here, of course. I mean, I've just shown you basic web applications and basic production readiness. When you want to deploy a Spring Boot application, you have many different options. Our application here lives on the shell. It's in this folder here, so I'm going to go here to JEEConf, okay? And I'm going to stop the application inside of IntelliJ. Goodbye. Go back to my shell. I'm going to do maven clean install. It's going to run the unit tests, the empty unit test that simply starts everything up for us. And then when I go to the target directory, you'll see that I have two jars, right? So the first jar is the snapshot, the original one, and that's 8 kilobytes. The other jar is the main one, and that's 31 megabytes. Okay, so that is, if you look at it, it's jar xvf demo.jar. You'll see that it has everything you need. It has everything that is required to run the application, including all the other jars, including Tomcat, including Spring Boot, including all of Hibernate, including everything, right? So if you want to deploy this to a Cloud Foundry or a Heroku or any other platform as a service, or if you just want to deploy it to somebody else, or if you just want to give it to somebody else, just tell them to run, that jar, and it'll start up the application just like normal. You can see we're using a regular shell here, right? So this shell, this is a regular TTYS terminal. Notice that we have very, very sensible logging, right? The colors in the terminal colors are already set for you. All the output is very, very clean. We don't have a lot of noise here. So all of that stuff that you should care about eventually is already taken care of for you. We've already got a clean logging solution already provided out of the box. Okay, so now I can still, same thing as before. Here's my application. If I go to bookings / I get the same data as before, except now I'm running the whole thing in just Java - jar, right? This is very convenient. You can give this whole application to somebody as a jar, and they can deploy it and start it and run it and so on. I should mention that, of course, there are from here many, many different places and things you can do. We have solutions for batch processing and for integration and for big data, for web services and security and whatever, right? And they all work in the same way. They're all very, very simple, automatically configured out of the box. This is all thanks to this @enable auto configuration. What this annotation does is it looks at spring.factories files, okay? These files come with Spring Boot out of the box. And these files are in each jar in the meta-inf directory, and they just contain some basic, configuration. It says org Spring Framework boot auto configure @enable auto configuration equals, and then it's just a comma delimited list. So AOP auto config, rabbit MQ auto configuration, message source and property placeholder auto configuration, Spring Batch, JPA, MongoDB, Redis, JDBC, JMS, JMX, Spring Mobile, Mongo, Reactor, our reactive web framework, our reactive messaging centric framework. All of this stuff is provided in these configuration classes, and they will all be, Spring Boot will try to load all of them when the application starts up. And I know you're thinking, well, that sounds horrible. I don't want to load, all this other stuff. I just need the stuff that is important to my application. So don't worry. this is true, right? Even though Spring Boot will try to load this configuration class, it will see this add configuration annotation, and it will try to load the configuration class. But before it does it, it will use this Spring 4 feature called add conditional. So add conditional can be used to test something, right? You could have your own add conditional annotation that tests for the value of a stock. It could test the weather. It could say, what is the horoscope, is Mercury in retrograde or whatever, right? In this case, we're saying, if the rabbit template type and the Spring AMQP channel class are not on the class path, then do not load this class. Do not load any of this configuration. And so even though we are attempting, we are trying to load the rabbit auto configuration class when Spring Boot starts up, it will not do it if this test is not true, right? So you can have configuration classes on the class path that are dynamic. They do things dynamically based on your environment, based on the Spring Boot context, the application context. You saw earlier that we did a health endpoint. So the health endpoint, we provided our own health endpoint based on convention, right? Well, if we wanted to, we could just use the existing one, but if we don't, we used our own, and that's because of this magic right here. We have a bean that has an add conditional definition, and the conditional says, if somebody else provides their own health endpoint, then do not bother. And in this case, we're saying, if somebody else provides their own health indicator, like ours, like we did in our own configuration, then use that, right? But otherwise, return a vanilla health indicator, right? So all we're doing is creating a health endpoint based on our own health indicator. Otherwise, it'll create its own default one. So you get the best of both worlds. You get this if you do nothing. You get a good, sane default. Otherwise, you get to override, right? So everything in Spring Boot is overridable, right? All these conditionals make sure that we check to see if there are other beans of certain types, or if there are properties of certain types or certain values in your property file. And so that's how a lot of this happens, right? So you get configuration, you get sane defaults, but you don't have to work too hard to override it, right? It's very, very smart. This is a very, very smart way to build microservices. So I'm sure you have heard about building small, singly focused, loosely coupled services. This is great for that kind of thing. It's production ready by default. There are some companies that are using Spring Boot already very successfully, like, for example, Netflix. But you can choose your own. Okay, are we out of time? Good. No problem. So thank you, everybody. I hope that was enough of an introduction. Are you? If you have questions, I will try and take them now. But that's that, I guess. Or is this the audience from the new talk? Mm-hmm. Spasiba. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I hope this was worth your time. Did you like this? Yes or no? Hands up. Would you ever use this? Hands up if you liked it. Okay, good.